I would like to begin by echoing the expressions of gratitude to Dominik for inviting me, for organizing this wonderful gathering. This has already been an incredibly rich set of discussions. I'm very much looking forward to whatever is thrown my way in Q&A. I should warn you, the main connection to AI here is that just like AI sometimes hallucinates when you ask it certain things, I may very well do so in Q&A, considering the state I'm in this evening. So take my responses with the grain of salt that you bring to your interactions with AI. My paper's content focuses primarily on the part of the conference title that emphasizes that this is an honor of Slavoj Žižek. And what I'm going to present is a further installment in a series of back and forth exchanges that he and I have had over the years about certain matters. If you are interested in links to AI, I am more than happy to field questions about that in Q&A, but I would confess I have no special expertise on this particular topic, save for my own personal interactions with chatbots, and of course, as department chair right now, dealing with the whole challenge of AI-driven plagiarism in my department, and that is, for the time being, the extent of my expertise. So, let me get underway. For over a decade now, Slavoj Žižek and I have been involved in a debate centered around his hybrid philosophical psychoanalytic engagements with quantum mechanics. To date, this debate has orbited around questions as to whether or not Žižek's appeals to the science of the smallest constituents of physical reality are compatible with the vigorously anti-reductive materialist ontology at the heart of his own metaphysics. Moreover, his most recent articulation of his core theoretical commitments, 2025's Quantum History, A New Materialist Philosophy, contains ample amounts of conceptual content relevant to this still unfolding debate between us. However, with quantum history in view, alongside three other recent books by Žižek, these would be 2022's Surplus Enjoyment, 2023's Freedom, and 2024's Christian Atheism, it has become apparent to me that at the center of our disagreements about materialism and its relations with one or more of the natural sciences lies an even more fundamental philosophical issue. This issue involves the question of how, particularly as contemporary materialist philosophers, we are to position ourselves with respect to Kant's legacy. More precisely, Žižek's latest philosophical labors of the past 4+ years confront me and his audience in general with the need to rethink the transcendental dimension forming the core of the Copernican revolution inaugurated in 1781 with the publication of the A edition of the Critique of Pure Reason. Multiple times in Žižek's most recent major theoretical works, he reaffirms a long-running assertion of his. Philosophy is much younger a discipline than is usually assumed. Instead of being approximately 2,500 years old, it is merely about a tenth of that, namely 245 years old to be exact. It begins, strictly speaking, only with Kant as the author of the first critique. Indeed, the past 2.5 centuries of Western philosophy have involved repeated attempts to appropriate and/or challenge Kant's perennially controversial accounts of the subjectivity-supplied conditions of possibility for experience, and with them, all actual and potential knowledge. In terms of this history of repeated attempts, Žižek tends to favor a handful of figures crucial for his own larger theoretical pursuits, primarily Hegel, Schelling, Lacan, and Heidegger, with the latter identified by him as embodying the quote-unquote culmination of Kantian transcendental thinking. Žižek's analyses of the legacy of Kant's transcendental also have him occasionally examining its role in the Marxist tradition. Žižek voices his approval specifically of Lukács's and Korsch's interrelated 1923 mobilizations of critical epistemological objections, ones rooted in Kantian transcendental idealism, against the materialist realism of Engels' Dialectics of Nature and its conscientious uptake by the likes of Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Correspondingly, Žižek rejects the final Lukács's reworking of Engelsian Naturdialektik in the massive but unfinished project on the ontology of social being. It therefore might seem that Žižek endorses why and how the young Lukács plays off historical against dialectical materialism to the benefit of the former by insisting that quote-unquote nature, even when invoked by scientists and philosophers, invariably is a socio-historically constructed category, rather than a designation of an objective reality existing in itself. Likewise, Žižek expresses severe reservations about today's new and/or speculative varieties of realism. Yet, Žižek simultaneously sometimes comes off as dismissive of Kant's transcendentalism with its critical epistemological conclusions. At one point, he unflatteringly compares post-Kantian transcendental idealists to Christian creationists as regards responding to the findings and implications of the empirical experimental modern sciences of nature, particularly as concerns the pre-human physical world. Of course, one of these sciences especially, quantum physics, is central to Žižek's present theoretical endeavors. As regards quantum mechanics, he insists on the irreducibility of this particular natural science to social history. Along closely related lines, he cautions that, quote, we should not reduce science to its role in capitalism, end quote. He even insists that, quote, trust in science is the very opposite of dogmatic orthodoxy. It is the trust in exploration which is constantly progressing, end quote. All of this is acutely at odds with his above-mentioned endorsement of the early Lukács's criticism of Engels. More broadly, Žižek in recent years even has been calling for a move, quote-unquote, beyond the transcendental. Is Žižek simply being inconsistent, carelessly contradicting himself apropos the topic of the transcendental? The answer to this question is a definite no, with a passage in Surplus Enjoyment explaining Žižek's shifts with respect to transcendentalism. Quote, this then is our deadlock. We have two ends of philosophy, the one in the positive science, occupying the field of old metaphysical speculations, and the one with Heidegger, who brought the transcendental approach to its radical conclusion, reducing philosophy to the description of the historical events, modes of disclosure of being. The two do not complement each other. They are mutually exclusive, but the imminent insufficiency of each of them opens up the space for the other. Science cannot close the circle and ground in its object the approach it uses when analyzing its object. Only transcendental philosophy can do this. Transcendental philosophy, which limits itself to describing different disclosures of being, has to ignore the ontic question, how are entities outside the horizon of their appearing to us? And science fills in this void with its claims about the nature of things. Is this parallax the ultimate stand of our thinking, or can we reach beyond, or rather beneath it, end quote. Subsequently, in Christian atheism, Žižek labels this fundamental tension the quote-unquote transcendental ontological parallax. In the quotation above from Surplus Enjoyment, Žižek asserts that, quote, transcendental philosophy has to ignore the ontic question, how are entities outside of the horizon of their appearing to us, and science fills in this void with its claims about the nature of things, end quote. The phrase outside the horizon of their appearing to us, especially in the context of a discussion of transcendentalism a la Kant, likely connotes for readers the idea of the noumenal realm of things in themselves beyond the limits of possible experience. However, particularly for those of us committed to developing a materialist recasting of the subjectivity central to the entire German idealist tradition, perhaps the most pressing theoretical task here is to pursue further another quote-unquote ontic question, namely, that of how we as entities are materially constituted, so to speak, beneath the horizon of phenomenal appearances, so as to help make possible in the first place all appearing to us, inclusive of appearing to ourselves. A materialist theory of the transcendental subject requires going beneath the transcendental more than just beyond it, with Žižek himself indicating as much when he asks here, quote, "Is this parallax the ultimate stand of our thinking, or can we reach beyond, or rather beneath it," end quote. What is more, Žižek, despite intermittently denying that science can, quote, "close the circle and ground in its object the approach it uses when analyzing its object," end quote, Žižek seems at the level of his larger ongoing philosophical project to be proposing that at least quantum mechanics, if no other sciences, indeed can somehow close the circle or reach beyond, or rather beneath, the transcendental ontological parallax. Žižek's increasingly prominent and frequent recourses to the physics of microscale natural being clearly intend to provide a physicalist basis for an account of the imminent material genesis of German idealist-style subjectivity. Indeed, at one point in quantum history, Žižek, addressing the experiential and socio-symbolic reality, partly but crucially made possible by the subject of German idealism, is quite explicit about this theoretical intention of his. Quote, "From my Hegelo-Lacanian standpoint, where does this reality come from is the philosophical problem, a problem that confronts us with the topic of the pre-ontological real, and this is why I am compelled to deal with quantum mechanics," end quote. In relation to the transcendental ontological parallax, it would seem that a quantum physics properly reinterpreted via a combination of philosophical and psychoanalytic resources promises to furnish an account of the emergence of the transcendental out of the ontological, the non-natural subject out of natural substance. Subsequently, in Surplus Enjoyment, Žižek brings Hegel and Marx, among others, into view in connection with the concept of the transcendental ontological parallax. It looks as though it is Hegel in particular who possesses the key to a proper handling of this parallax. Žižek's Hegel has no interest in sublating this parallax via some sort of synthesis of the antinomy between the transcendental and the ontological. Instead, Žižek, in line with his own distinctive form of Hegelianism, insists on the impossible to sublate or synthesize, quote-unquote, irreducible gap between these two dimensions. Quantum history returns to this topic. Therein, Žižek claims, apropos a Hegelian take on the transcendental ontological parallax, quote, "The space for the experience of the divine is the gap that forever separates the transcendental from the objective realist approach. But this divine dimension refers to the moment of madness preceding discourse, to the experience of radical negativity, what mystics and Hegel called the night of the world, which precludes any theology focused on a positive figure of God, even if this figure of God is radically secularized in modern scientific naturalism," end quote. Later in the same book, Žižek emphasizes that this, quote, "gap opens up and sustains the very space of dialectics," end quote, as the, quote-unquote, non-dialectical presupposition of dialectics. He likewise underscores that, quote, "it all begins with a crack, a fall that affects any imagined beginning," end quote, and that this, quote, "gap is at work from the very beginning," end quote. That is to say, this gap or crack has an absolutely originary primordial status, a fundamental grounding role for what could be described as Žižek's dialectical materialism, as what he himself calls a quote-unquote materialist theology. In this same vein, Christian atheism appeals to, quote, "a gap out of which our reality appears," end quote. As can be discerned from the preceding, Žižek distinguishes between two versions of dialectical materialism. On the one hand, there is the naive realist dialectical materialism of the Marxist tradition, inaugurated by Engels and carried forward mainly by Lenin, Mao, and various other non-Western Marxists. On the other hand, and opposed to this bad sort of dialectical materialism, there is a good sort, namely Žižek's materialist theology. I will say more about how Žižek redeploys the label dialectical materialism a little later. For the moment, I want to pause so as to raise three questions in relation to what has been laid out thus far. My first question here has to do with Žižek's insistence that, quote, we should not be afraid to use the term theology to circumscribe the obscure area that eludes any ontology, transcendental or naively realist, end quote. Along the same lines, he claims in Christian atheism that, quote, the space of theosophy is located in the gap that makes the transcendental dimension irreducible to ontology, end quote. But can theology, or any other ology for that matter, entirely avoid anything and everything ontological? In connection with this first question, I would claim that one of the crucial upshots of Hegel's criticisms of Kantian transcendental idealism is that ontological commitments ultimately are unavoidable when all is said and done. Even if one refuses to put forward ontological posits in the name of prioritizing epistemology at the expense of ontology, as is done in certain versions of both empiricism and Kantianism, one nonetheless inevitably presupposes an ontology in erecting an epistemology. This holds as well for epistemologically justified methodologies in the various and sundry sciences and other intellectual disciplines. I admittedly find myself hard-pressed even to conceive of a theology that truly would be utterly devoid of an ontology, whether presupposed or posited. Moreover, given that Žižek's theology is avowedly materialist, the very invocation of materialism cannot but suggest a certain set of clearly ontological commitments. Therefore, the gap of Žižek's transcendental ontological parallax will have to be somehow or other situated with respect to its ontological side, and this rather than basing said parallax in a third theological dimension. Or, put differently and in a fitting Hegelian manner, Žižek's distinction between the transcendental and the ontological would have to be internal to the ontological itself. Does he not suggest precisely this when he proposes that, in Hegel's system, the separation between the logical and the real is internal to the real itself? Or when he states that, quote, the disparity between subject and substance is simultaneously the disparity of the substance with itself, end quote, with subject as transcendental and substance as ontological. Second, why treat the gap at the center of the transcendental ontological parallax as quote-unquote divine? Why divinize it? In quantum history, Žižek indeed openly characterizes his own materialism as quote-unquote mystic. I would propose in passing that none other than Hegel himself provides a non-mystical and fully rational, qua dialectical speculative, argumentative front against both anti-realist psychological and subjective idealisms, as well as the extreme of full-blown solipsism. To be more precise, Hegel's problematizations of concepts along the lines of the Kantian limits of possible experience and accompanying things in themselves demonstrate the philosophical impossibility of upholding a partition strictly separating subjective ideality from objective reality. Hegel, through his multi-pronged critique of Kant's theoretical philosophy as transcendental idealism, shows that this partition undermines and sublates itself upon close rational inspection. At a number of points in quantum history, Žižek sounds as though he concurs with Hegel's criticisms of Kant's interconnected noumenal-phenomenal distinction in thing in itself. Hegelian logic, in its imminent critical Aufhebung of subjective idealism in similar positions, proves indirectly but non-mystically that, as Žižek puts it, quote, we are not alone, we are embedded in material reality, end quote. If so, then why, at least as a Hegelian, not to mention as a materialist, why court the peril of even seeming to flirt with, quote unquote, any kind of spiritualism by having recourse to the notion of mysticism? even if one concedes that the discrepancy between the transcendental and the ontological is ultimate and insurmountable, why respond to it with mystical ecstasy? Why not respond to it instead with the same sober, shoulder-shrugging "es ist so" of the unimpressed young Hegel facing the snow-covered Alps? Would the latter be any less materialist than mysticism? Furthermore, in Christian atheism, Žižek explicitly warns against deifying the split between the transcendental and the ontological as the gap or crack of the Hegelian night of the world. The deification of the transcendental ontological parallax, identifying this rift as God, would be, by Žižek's lights, a mistake. Yet, what distinguishes deifying such negativity from mystifying it as per a mystical materialism? What is more, why does Žižek himself describe the gap or crack of the transcendental ontological parallax, this negativity qua night of the world, as a quote-unquote divine dimension? Why does he likewise put forward an equation between God and absolute negativity? It looks as though Žižek has in mind an implicit distinction between, on the one hand, deification, and on the other hand, divinization and or mystification. But in what this distinction might consist admittedly remains somewhat unclear to me. Žižek also refers to a figure of God that is, quote, radically secularized in modern scientific naturalism, end quote. This indicates that, in Žižek's view, a science-informed naturalization of the night of the world, generative of the transcendental ontological parallax, would be tantamount to an erroneous deification of this negativity as a baseless base, a groundless ground of reality. In this context, scientific naturalism is dismissed as merely replacing the theological God with a pseudo-secular substitute for him. This substitute would be nature with a capital N as a completely unified one-all, a thoroughly lawful and exhaustively well-ordered totality or whole as the locus and guarantee of all scientific knowledge. If science-allied naturalism relies on a background image of its explanatory jurisdiction that amounts to a mere pseudo-secularization of the deified big other, then, on Žižek's assessment, naturalizing the transcendental ontological parallax is to be avoided. Doing so would once again erroneously deify this gap or crack. However, is science-informed naturalism always and inevitably wedded to nature as God? Are all naturalisms conditioned by the natural sciences automatically fated to fall under the sway of a God masquerading as nature? I would maintain that this is not the case. Without going into the details on this occasion, my concept of weak nature is part of an effort to establish a non-reductive philosophical naturalism inclusive of a materialist theory of denaturalized subjectivity that is informed by the natural sciences while simultaneously showing these same sciences not to point in the direction of a godlike nature with a capital N. In Christian atheism, Žižek seems to endorse such a naturalistic program, remarking, quote, "Therein resides the difficulty of being a true materialist today, not just in advocating science against all forms of spiritualism, but, as Althusser saw it clearly decades ago, to defend science against its own spontaneous ideology, operative in, and maybe especially in, its most reductionist forms," end quote. Žižek similarly refers to a nature reconceptualized via Lacan's not all, with quantum mechanics itself destroying the very notion of a quote-unquote great book of nature as a really existing and scientifically knowable totality, as the whole of a complete cosmic big other. Žižek opts to tie the transcendental ontological parallax to a mystical materialism qua materialist theology, precisely so as to avoid associating it with a faux atheistic scientistic naturalism. But what if a genuinely atheistic naturalism, one that repudiates the false idol of nature as God, in favor of asserting the irreducible disunity of both nature and the natural sciences, What if such a heterodox naturalism is on offer? Especially considering the spiritualistic and deifying/divinizing connotations invariably emanating from invocations of mysticism and theology, why not opt instead for a radically secularized scientific naturalism as the best philosophical frame within which to situate the transcendental ontological parallax, with its crack as the night of the world? Do not Žižek's own reflections on quantum mechanics entail, among other implications, a radical secularization qua de-deification/de-divinization of both nature and scientific naturalism? Why then does Žižek still feel compelled to appeal to mysticism and theology in addition to physics, when non-mystical and non-theological physics alone looks to be more than sufficient for his intellectual purposes? Early on in quantum history, Žižek, apropos the split of the transcendental ontological parallax, maintains that this, quote, absolute gap, a crack in the texture of reality, is the foundation of atheism, end quote. In the same book, Žižek also unambiguously identifies Hegel as an atheist, with the latter barring God as an absolute big other. Furthermore, Hegel, along with Schelling too, repeatedly is depicted as pushing beyond the transcendental in Kant's immediate wake. For Žižek, quote, the space beyond the transcendental is the space to which Hegelian thought belongs, end quote. This space is, on his assessment, the, quote, most radical dimension in Hegel's thought, end quote, with the passage from logic to real philosophy epitomizing this sublating move, surpassing the limits of Kant's transcendental idealism. I remain convinced that a combination of Hegelianism, atheism, materialism, and naturalism is fundamentally incompatible with anything mystical and or theological, no matter how heretical and unorthodox the mysticism and or theology. Is there a way to proceed beyond the transcendental without deifying, divinizing, or mystifying this beyond? What about getting beneath the transcendental in a properly Hegelian, atheistic, materialist, and naturalistic fashion? This is where Žižek's ongoing quantum physical reinvention of the tradition of dialectical materialism becomes especially relevant and important to scrutinize further. One of Žižek's recent clarifications about why he chooses, sometimes provocatively, to identify himself as a dialectical materialist comes immediately on the heels of him characterizing the beyond of the transcendental as the domain of mysticism and theology. Referring to the forays into this beyond by the likes of Hegel, Schelling, Benjamin, and Lacan, not to mention Eckhart Böhme et al., he elaborates, quote, why do I call the position towards which all these different approaches tend dialectical materialism, a term that is difficult to dissociate from the Stalinist tradition, a term which stands for philosophical ideology at its most stupid, for a philosophy that has no cognitive value but just serves to justify political decisions. Because I think what I have in mind here is ultimately unnameable. There is no proper name for it. So the only solution is to use a term which signals as clearly as possible its own inadequacy. In other words, the claim Hegel is a dialectical materialist should be read as a new version of the speculative statement, the spirit is a bone. Taken directly, the claim is an obvious nonsense. There is an infinite gap between Hegel's thought and dialectical materialism. However, Hegel's thought is precisely the thought of this gap, end quote. My first response here is to propose that Stalin's 1938 booklet, Dialectical and Historical Materialism, in all its undeniable ideological pragmatic stupidity, is far from emblematic of the dialectical materialist tradition overall, an orientation including an arc of Soviet thinkers from Lenin to Ilyenkov, as well as such Western Marxist philosophers as the later Lukács and Althusser, among others. I would go even further. I believe that Žižek's own bigger picture philosophical project would benefit in multiple ways from closer examination with some of the better examples of non-Stalinist dialectical materialism. That said, I want to zero in on the phrenological infinite judgment from Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, as invoked in the passage above from Surplus Enjoyment. Instead of reading spirit as a bone, as suitable for describing the relationship between Hegel as spirit and dialectical materialism as bone or even bone-headed, I would suggest that, with the transcendental ontological parallax in view, the phrase dialectical materialism on its own already exhibits a parallel with the speculative statement Hegel extracts out of phrenology. To be more precise, my suggestion is that the adjective dialectical can be taken as corresponding with the term spirit, qua the transcendental domain of thinking subjectivity with its non-empirical categories and concepts, and the noun materialism can be taken as corresponding with the term bone, qua the ontological domain of substantial being with its natural and socio-historical dimensions. Indeed, the core division at the very heart of Hegel's system, the one between logic and philosophy of the real, is acknowledged by Žižek himself, as seen earlier, to amount to a confrontation by Hegel with the parallactic cleft between transcendental spirit, logic, and ontological bone, philosophy of the real. In this sense, Žižek is quite right that, as regards the crack of the transcendental ontological parallax, quote, Hegel's thought is precisely the thought of this gap, end quote. Žižek has a lot more to say about dialectical materialism in his books of the past several years. In Surplus Enjoyment, he proposes that, quote, the basic feature of the dialectically materialist vision is that of irreducible reflexivity inscribed in the universe, end quote. He soon adds on the same page, quote, with regard to Hegel, if I say subject is substance, I imply that the true substance of reality is subject, that subject is the ground which generates all reality. But if I say substance is subject, I indicate that substance is in itself subjective, marked by cuts, inconsistencies, incomplete, end quote. These statements by Žižek taken together arguably entail an implicitly emergentist and anti-idealistic interpretation of Hegel's substance also as subject. In terms of emergentism, Žižek's Hegelian subject is substance becomes self-reflexive, namely a thinking immanent to being, with the latter being achieving consciousness of itself in and through the former, thinking. In terms of anti-idealism, the subjective quality Žižek attributes to the substance giving rise to subject does not refer to the sentient and sapient mindedness of familiar forms of psychological and or subjective idealisms. Instead, this substance might be said to be proto-subjective insofar as, in and of itself in its objectivity, it already is shot through with the conflicts and antagonisms usually attributed to the subject alone as separate and distinct from substance. For Žižek, with his blended Hegelian-Lacanian theory of subjectivity, the split subject is made possible by the split already within substance. Similarly, the gap between subjectivity and substantiality is already a gap within substantiality itself. This is precisely where quantum physics becomes absolutely crucial for Žižek's pursuits. In the introduction to quantum history, he declares that, quote, the philosophical implications of quantum mechanics furnish the basis for a new form of dialectical materialism, end quote. And in line with his just summarized glosses on Hegel's substance also as subject, he depicts Geist as a return of the quantum repressed. That is to say, and with reference to the collapse of the wave function in quantum mechanics, a reference pivotal for Žižek himself, the negativity of spiritual subjectivity is the reactualization within post-collapse reality of the negativity of natural substantiality as the pre-collapse quantum ontological real. This pre-collapse real, as desubstantialized substance, is for Žižek the ultimate physical yet transcendental possibility condition for both post-collapse reality as well as subjects imminently transcendent vis-a-vis this reality. In a reversal of the Lenin of 1908's Materialism and Empirio-Criticism, the quantum physical, quote-unquote, disappearance of matter is celebrated by Žižek as a scientific opportunity for reinventing dialectical materialism, rather than, as Lenin feared, as an opportunity for the philosophical enemies of materialism to claim scientific backing. Žižek depicts the quantum domain, in more Lacanian terms, as strangely already in itself proto-symbolic, weirdly anticipating in its natural objectivity the peculiar structures and dynamics specific to signifiers and signifier-mediated subjects. Correlatively, he maintains that, quote, subject does not stand for another ontological level different from substance, but for the immanent incompleteness, inconsistency, antagonism of substance itself, end quote. However, at one point, Žižek slightly tempers these quantum physics-inspired speculations when he remarks, quote, although there seem to be good empirical reasons to reject the grounding of the psychic unconscious directly in quantum physics, the broad parallel which confers on the unconscious a pre-ontological status seems valid and productive, end quote. In prior exchanges with Žižek, I have raised concerns about the validity and productivity of this quote-unquote broad parallel between pre-collapse substance and post-collapse subject. I will not rehearse those concerns here. Rather, I want at present to add a new concern over and above my previous ones with respect to Žižek's quantum physical rendition of dialectical materialism. By Žižek's own admission, there are, between pre-collapse real substantiality and post-collapse symbolic subjectivity, multiple layers of reality, classically physical, chemical, organic, etc. In sum, the domains of nature forming the explanatory jurisdictions of various natural sciences, targeting realities at scales bigger than the quantum level. With this fact in view, my question for Žižek here is, how does pre-collapse proto-reality resurface within post-collapse nature as the negativity of the subjective night of the world? Asked with greater precision, exactly how is it that the structures and dynamics of pre-collapse quantum entities and events manage not to be screened out by the larger than quantum scale strata of post-collapse nature? A more specific version of this same question would be, how must the human organism, particularly this organism's central nervous system as a material substrate seeming to be most immediately grounding of human cognition, emotion, and motivation, how must this organism be biologically configured so as to enable and facilitate, rather than thwart and eclipse, the return of the pre-collapse quantum repressed within post-collapse reality? Or, to raise this query in Schellingian terms often utilized by Žižek, what precise features of existence make both possible and actual the re-erupting of ground within existence in and as singular free subjects? Whether this line of questioning should be addressed philosophically, via non-empirical analyses of the concepts at play, or scientifically as an empirically tractable problem, is itself a serious theoretical question too. Leaving these difficulties related to quantum physics aside for the time being, another aspect of Žižek's recent treatments of dialectical materialism deserves attention. On a couple of occasions over the course of the past few years, Žižek has gestured in passing at an equivalence between his version of dialectical materialism and what he sometimes enigmatically designates as quote-unquote meta-transcendentalism. My strong exegetical hunch is that what Žižek has in mind with the meta-transcendental would be the real possibility conditions at the level of natural substance for the advent of the non-natural transcendental subject as per German idealism. On the basis of this interpretive inference, I now want to examine what such a meta-transcendentalism requires and entails. In light of my preceding reconstructions of Žižek's current philosophical work, what he means by the meta-transcendental can be deciphered through combining his concept of the transcendental ontological parallax with his quantum mechanical recasting of dialectical materialism. The negativity of the desubstantialized substance of the quantum physical real is the meta-transcendental condition of possibility for the emergence of the symbolic transcendental subject that itself furnishes further conditions of possibility, as initially outlined by Kant and then developed, of course, by many of Kant's successors. This subject itself, in turn, makes possible knowledge of this very emergence and the at least apparently irreducible discrepancies as parallactic between itself as thinking and the substance as being from which it emerged. My repeated use of permutations of the term emergence in this context is no accident. I am quite deliberately pointing to the ensemble of theoretical positions subsumed under the heading of emergentism. Elsewhere, I have argued that the philosophies of nature put forward by Schelling and Hegel involve aspects of emergentism avant la lettre. That is, before both John Stuart Mill's musings about quote-unquote heteropathic or quote-unquote heterogeneous laws in his 1843 A System of Logic, as well as the subsequent rise of classical British emergentism in the early 20th century, a la C. Lloyd Morgan, Samuel Alexander, and C.D. Broad. I've made similar arguments about Marxian dialectical materialism as foreshadowing the emergentisms of the past century of Anglo-American analytic philosophy, from the British emergentists to various contemporary figures and positions in philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, and metaphysics. Žižek himself regularly employs the term emergence along with a family of more or less synonymous terms, such as arising, erupting, exploding, springing, and the like. He does so precisely when, through syntheses of German idealism, Marxism, and psychoanalysis, he discusses the topic of the genesis of symbolic transcendental subjectivity out of real ontological substance, with all of this currently being rearticulated in and through the discourse of quantum physics. As ought to be glaringly obvious at this juncture, Žižek's heterodox dialectical materialism is nothing if not vehemently opposed to both reductive and eliminative varieties of materialism, naturalism, and/or physicalism. Furthermore, for anyone wishing to espouse materialism while navigating between the scylla of reductivisms and eliminativisms and the Charybdis of ontological dualisms or outright spirit monisms of an idealist sort, some type of emergentism looks to be philosophically unavoidable as an essential ingredient of any and every variety of non-reductive materialism. That is to say, Žižek's appeals to emergence not only are philosophically appropriate and well-motivated, they arguably are mandatory, indispensable components of his present ongoing theoretical labors apropos transcendentalism and dialectical materialism. Yet, over the past 4+ years, Žižek repeatedly has taken me to task for my manners of elaborating a similar anti-reductive materialism linked to both emergentism and meta-transcendentalism, as well as likewise drawing on German idealism, Marxism, and psychoanalysis, albeit with, on the natural scientific side of things, a focus on neurobiology rather than quantum mechanics. Žižek's pushback against me comes down to two main criticisms. First, my fashions of deploying emergentism are accused of promoting an ontology depicting a great chain of being, continuously evolving beings' levels: physical, chemical, biological, sentient, sapient, we could add AI to this list, in an uninterrupted process as, quote, a simple gradual evolutionary progress which ignores the cuts and retroactivity that characterize a proper dialectical process, end quote. Second, I allegedly am guilty of regressing back to naive pre-Kantian metaphysics through ignoring the dimension of the transcendental altogether. What are my responses to these two criticisms? Apropos the first criticism regarding my purportedly non-dialectical emergentism, I suspect that Žižek is taking inspiration from Lacan in this vein. The latter recurrently charges evolutionary theory with, whether its theorists admit it or not, promoting a more general ontological vision in which a slow and steady process of change inexorably and smoothly bends in the teleological direction of eventually giving rise to human consciousness as its telos qua the supposed crown of creation. Starting in Seminar 7, Lacan harshly treats evolution, insofar as it ostensibly pictures a unified great chain of being with a special place reserved for conscious and self-conscious human beings, as barely disguised religiosity. What Lacan objects to along these lines apropos evolution, Žižek objects to as regards emergentism. Additionally, Žižek's insistence on, quote, the cuts and retroactivity that characterize a proper dialectical process, end quote, can be heard as echoing Lacan's countering of evolutionary theory with creation ex nihilo, an originally theological idea Lacan claims ironically provides an atheistic alternative to worldviews relying on anything in the vein of the great chain of being as a thinly veiled substitute for God. My reply is straightforward. Both Lacan and Žižek are mistaken in these instances. Neither evolutionary theory nor emergentism are always and automatically invested in conceptualizations of evolution and emergence, respectively, in which uninterrupted continuums and final causes reign supreme. Evolutionary theory not only eschews any and all teleologies. Already during Lacan's lifetime, specifically in the early 1970s, Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould famously introduced the quote-unquote punctuated equilibria model of evolution. Beginning with thinkers such as Eldredge and Gould, evolution is reconceived as a directionless, contingency-driven staccato movement of fits and starts, calm plateaus and frenzied leaps, propelled and buffeted by both biological and extra-biological variables. With this in view, thank you, yes. Well, bear in mind, I've been living in the desert southwest of the United States for close to 20 years now, and my body has gotten used to basically zero humidity. So whenever I travel anywhere else, any non-desert climate, I sweat like crazy. My body just has no tolerance for it anymore, despite the fact that I grew up in a subtropical climate, namely Atlanta, Georgia, which for 6 months out of the year, everybody sweats like this. So anyhow, perhaps I'm just in the wrong place. All right. I think I can get through it. Yeah. Žižek's insistence on, quote, the cuts and retroactivity that characterize a proper dialectical process, end quote, can be heard as echoing Lacan's countering of evolutionary theory with creation ex nihilo. Oh, I'm sorry, I already had read that part. This is where the jet lag and sleep deprivation are really beginning to make themselves felt. So after the mention of Eldredge and Gould, with this in view, Lacan's sweeping indictment of evolution cannot but appear as a set of outdated assertions targeting certain popular misconceptions and bastardizations of evolutionary theory, rather than the theoretical framework itself, strictly speaking. As for emergentism and contra Žižek, it neither presupposes nor posits a harmonious and hierarchical stack of strata seamlessly flowing into each other as one giant cosmic organism or monistic and monotheistic deus sive natura, although Schelling's proto-emergentism, thanks especially to his virulent Spinozism, often veers far in this direction. Ironically, philosophers and scientists inclined toward reductive and eliminative physicalisms regularly complain that emergentism from the early 20th century through today rests on a dogmatic Mysterianism, insofar as quote-unquote emergence names an inexplicable jump or shift, creating ex nihilo an irreducible cut between an emergent and its emergence base. I have great difficulty imagining these reductionist or eliminativist philosophers and scientists not reacting with similar complaints were they to be confronted with Žižek's quantum physical dialectical materialism. Of course, my own materialist musings would elicit identical negative reactions too. This hints that Žižek and I might be closer in our positions than his recent criticisms of me indicate. One of the classical British emergentists in particular, Alexander, is worth mentioning before proceeding further. In a famous passage from Alexander's 1920 two-volume Space, Time, and Deity, he declares, quote, "The existence of emergent qualities is something to be noted, as some would say, under the compulsion of brute empirical fact, or, as I should prefer to say in less harsh terms, to be accepted with the natural piety of the investigator. It admits of no explanation," end quote. At least to my ears, Žižek's gap or crack of the transcendental ontological parallax, this night of the world, likewise sounds as though it is held up as an inexplicable brute fact to be regarded with natural piety as part of what Žižek himself describes as a mystical materialism. This cross-resonance between Alexander and Žižek reinforces the impression that Žižek's constant recourse to the term emergence and its permutations and variants is no coincidence. As with other versions of non-reductive materialism, Žižek's quantum mechanical dialectical materialism likewise must centrally involve some form of emergence in its efforts to thread the needle between, on the one side, reductionisms and eliminativisms, and on the other side, dualisms and spiritualisms. What about Žižek's second main criticism in recent years, namely that I thumb my nose at the Kantian transcendental with its epistemological implications? I already mentioned a while ago that I follow Hegel's lead here, specifically his imminent critical passing through, rather than bypassing of, Kant's transcendental idealism with its limits of possible experience and things in themselves. Particularly as crystallized in the moment of passage from logic to real philosophy, Hegel shows why and how a subjective idealism like that of Kant cannot avoid pushing itself beyond itself back into realism, albeit now a post-critical rather than pre-critical realism justified in and through the sublation of transcendental idealism. Furthermore, it is fitting in the present context to recall an exchange between Žižek and me going back to the early 2000s. In response to Žižek's pre-publication manuscript version of his 2004 book, Organs Without Bodies, I suggested to him that quantum physics can be interpreted as a precise 180-degree inversion of the Kant of the first critique. Whereas Kant's idealism buttresses itself with a dialectics of pure reason, the realism of quantum mechanics leads to a dialectics of sensible intuition, objects that can be in more than one place simultaneously, that can be both waves and particles, that can travel backwards in time, etc. Žižek endorses this subsequently in 2006 as the parallax view. All of this said, what is crucial to appreciate at this point is that Žižek's heavy reliances on both Hegel and quantum physics are themselves inseparably bound up with realist ontological commitments on the other side of Kant's self-styled Copernican revolution. In 2023's Freedom, Žižek, as regards the legacy of the Kantian transcendental, triangulates the positions of him, me, and Robert Pippin. Žižek rightly characterizes Pippin's version of Hegel as indefensibly reducing the latter to a Kantian subjective transcendental idealist. Žižek's next move is to propose his own, so to speak, third way beyond the antagonism between Pippin and myself. Žižek claims that Pippin and I form what would be nothing other than his own transcendental ontological parallax, with Pippin on the transcendental side and me on the ontological side. Based on claims already advanced by me earlier here, I would say to this that for me, as a Hegelian, the very distinction between the ontological and the transcendental is a distinction internal to the ontological itself. I think that this is Žižek's basic stance too, at least when he is one, not talking about mystical theological materialism, and two, not responding to me. Likewise, his consistent emphasis, including throughout his recent books, on the full immanence of transcendental subject to ontological substance, with the former emerging within the latter, leaves me again wondering whether our views are as divergent as is asserted by Žižek in recent work. Before moving to a conclusion, which is coming quickly, one other feature of the preceding block quotation merits highlighting. Oh, well, I didn't read the quotation aloud due to skipping over it in the interest of time. Let me see. In opposition to me, Žižek endorses an interpretation of the relationship between logic and philosophy of the real in Hegel's system that not only do I find problematic, it goes against Žižek's own Hegel interpretations elsewhere, as well as his espousal of anything that could count as materialism properly speaking. He says, quote, Johnston ultimately endorses the idea of basic material positive reality, weak as it is, ignoring the fact that this reality is not a starting point, but already in itself the outcome of a radical negation, of logic releasing nature out of itself in Hegel, of quantum waves in physics, end quote. Hegel himself, in the famous final paragraph of The Science of Logic, warns that the transition from logic to Realphilosophie is not a matter of a quote-unquote process of becoming, Gewordensein, or a quote-unquote transition, Übergang. Hegelian logic is a starting point strictly in the sense of philosophical thinking in the wake of Kantian epistemological critique, needing to begin with the conditions of any and all intelligibility so as to avoid lapsing into the dogmatism of pre-Kantian metaphysics. Hegelian logic, neither at its end nor at any point before then, is about a ghostly, ethereal, quote-unquote, realm of shadows, ontologically and temporally pre-existing the natural and socio-historical realities of Hegel's philosophy of the real. The categories and concepts of Hegel's logic, in line with his general Aristotelian hylomorphist inclinations, are ontologically and temporally immanent to, coextensive with, and inseparable from the realities of his Realphilosophie. Apart from Žižek writing of, quote, logic releasing nature out of itself in Hegel, end quote, when objecting to me in the prior passages cited, I think he otherwise at least would concur with me that this particular piece of phrasing of his risks being an infelicitous formulation. It too readily makes it sound as though the central relationship between logic and Realphilosophie in Hegel's system is one of an ontological and temporal transition from the logical to the natural as two interlinked but distinct ontological regions or spheres. Again, I believe Žižek would, at a minimum, agree with me that, apropos the Hegelian edifice, implying or asserting the natural to emerge ontologically and temporally from the logical, as itself a metaphysically real shadow world, is to advance a misinterpretation very much to be rejected. Žižek's allusion to my concept of weak nature enables me, in approaching a close, 2 paragraphs away from it, to further strengthen the impression that we might remain closer philosophically than he seems to recognize as of late. In Christian atheism, he claims, quote, God gives us freedom by way of erasing itself out of the picture, end quote. Given my materialist atheism, I would prefer to rephrase this as, quote, nature gives us freedom by way of erasing itself out of the picture, end quote. This would be one way of capturing a core aspect of what I have in mind with weak nature, itself inspired in part by Hegel's discussions of impotent or powerless Ohnmacht nature. What I am offering is a non-mystical and non-theological complement to the weak God of Žižek's mystical and theological Christian materialist atheism. Last paragraph. At one point in quantum history, Žižek insightfully identifies a key research program for any quote-unquote true materialist. He declares, quote, the task is not to grasp how reality is in itself, independently of our mind. The task is to locate our mind itself, inclusive of its antagonisms, gaps, and tensions, and inclusive of its symbolic constructions of objective reality into a historical real, end quote. Since the literal and not just the Lacanian time for concluding has arrived, I will keep my final remarks very short. I profoundly agree with Žižek about the foundational theoretical philosophical task facing materialism today. I also am convinced that our agreements far outweigh our disagreements. As I see it, our shared cause of reinventing dialectical materialism especially one inclusive of an anti-reductive account of subjectivity, will require resources from, in addition to and in tandem with quantum physics, emergentism, epigenetics, neuroplasticity, extended mind and predictive brain models, anti-epiphenomenalist accounts of downward, top-down, and/or mental causation and related concepts. If there is to be a quote-unquote reality of fictions, as Žižek puts it, then these theoretical resources are invaluable for demonstrating exactly that. I will end simply by proposing that we push forward with this task together. There is much work still to do. Thank you.
Thanks for this final talk. We don't have much time left.
Perfect.
Sadly. Yeah, okay.
No questions.
Maybe some, let's say 5 to maximum 10 minutes, because I have a reservation in front of me. It's sad that Žižek isn't there to give really some response, but Andrew, you have your first question.
Thank you so much. I'll try to be quick. If we think about Kant's first antinomy, according to which, yes, we have to account for our being where we are in time, but we're unable to account for it either if we think that past history of the world is finite or that the past history of the world is infinite. It points us towards a different conception of emergence, one that's non-temporal. I think that if you then get from Schelling and Hegel the idea that, well, but look, we need to jump to the absolute and somehow think emergence, then I would say Žižek's key idea is that what needs to emerge is time itself, or the arrow of time, and that's what quantum mechanics, he thinks, can give us.
Yes, but what's interesting there is specifically in, and I think the only place where he elaborates this in detail is in his newest book, or at least his newest major theoretical book, 2025's Quantum History, right? And there, as I understand him, Žižek, drawing on quantum physicists such as Ravelli, argues that, well, time is indeed, you might say, an illusion due to the particular situation that we minded, human beings are in terms of our finitude, and that it is, thanks to certain, you might say, insurmountable epistemic constraints that we are compelled, because of our ignorance, lack of insight into the quantum level, being stuck, experiencing things at larger than quantum scale, et cetera, that it's only because of that we have the experience of the arrow of time, right? But then, of course, Žižek also wants to say that part of what entitles us to argue that, well, instead of taking the standard reductionist or eliminativist scientific approach and then arguing that, well, see, physics has demonstrated that time is an illusion, that is just, an artifact of our ignorance, and that, therefore we should just write it out of our ontology, not really consider it as having any, weight or import in our inventory of what counts, et cetera. That, of course, Žižek wants to say, no, that human ignorance, including our limited, flawed, depictions of objective reality, inclusive of modeling things in a way that reflects, for example, the pure form of intuition that is time as inner sense with its linear chronological arrangement, that can exert consequences in the physical real, right? Because based on our illusions, our ignorance, et cetera, that has causative power. It is not merely epiphenomenal. So if Žižek wants to be able to use this thing in quantum physics to, say, all right, the illusory status of the arrow of time emerges thanks to our finitude and our, inability to see into the quantum level as it really is, that he wants to say that this still has causative consequences and hence some ontological status. But to get that's where I think he needs things like, in particular, top-down, downward, or mental causation, as it's called in the analytic literature I was referencing in philosophy of mind, and the ability to account for that in a way that still can be deemed materialist and hence face some of the challenges that, hard-nosed physicalists arguing against things like emergentism and top-down causation want to deploy against it. And I think that requires not only certain aspects of emergentism, I think you have to have the idea of the epigenetic and neuroplastic, organism, where you can start seeing how things like, phenomenal experience that results from ignorance and illusion can nonetheless start having effects that show up literally at the level of the physical real. That's something where I think he needs some of these resources that he either doesn't seem to draw on for reasons I don't know, or rejects, like when he just dismisses all of emergentism as this is just going to recapitulate some great chain of being, story, and I don't want to be doing that.
Okay, I think that the time is up because this was now more or less 5 minutes. Okay, thanks everybody. We will see us tomorrow at 9:30. Everybody has a good night. See you tomorrow. Bye. And thanks again.